Retirement is supposed to be the time where you get to finally enjoy all the things that you've worked so hard to achieve, whether that's traveling the world or spending more time with family or just tackling the bucket list. But how do you know if you're truly ready to retire? So today we're going to go through 15 questions to see how retirement ready you are. Some of these are questions that you probably haven't given much thought to, but they can really make a difference when it comes to planning for your retirement. So stick around and let's see if you're on track right here on the Canadian Money Roadmap podcast. Before we get into the list of 15 questions, I already took these questions and I put them into a free retirement readiness scorecard that you can access in the link below. If you're listening on the podcast, you can find the link in the show notes. I've had a bunch of you filling out the scorecard already, so it's pretty cool to see how you've answered some of these questions. And in future episodes, I hope to kind of go through some of those questions and see where some common gaps are and provide a little bit more context into that specific question. But for now, head over there, click on the link, and you can get started and see what your score is, and you can follow along with me if you'd like. My questions are in no particular order here, and so we'll just go through each of them and we'll see why each of these is important to think about when it comes to planning for a confident retirement. Okay, question number 1. Do you have a clear vision of what you want your retirement to look like? That could look like travel, hobbies, part-time work, something like that. Why is this question important to consider? Well, if you don't know what you want your retirement to look like, and in many cases, I talk about retirement as retiring to something as opposed to retiring from a job that you hate, for example. So if you don't know what you're retiring to, it's really tough to plan the financial how of how you're going to make that work. And so a very, very good first step is to sit down and actually think about what do you want to do with your time, with your resources, and who you're going to do it with. Question number 2, do you know how much you're going to need to maintain your lifestyle during retirement? If you have thought about your lifestyle goals and how you want to spend your time and who you want to do it with, what is that actually going to cost? It's all well and good to say, yeah, I want to go to this place and I want to sit on a beach in Mexico for 3 months of the year. And then all through summer, we're going to travel through Europe all the time. Oh yeah. And then we're going to fly the kids out from Toronto so that they can come visit us and all these different things. You need to put dollars to paper and actually see what it's going to cost to fund that lifestyle now that you have a good idea of what you want to do. Getting clear on the annual expenses that you're going to need to cover is a really great next step to cover. Question number 3, again, this is in no particular order of importance or anything like that, but are you planning for the first 10 to 15 years of your retirement to look differently than the later years and how that your spending might increase or decrease along the way? In the scorecard, I have scored this one a little bit lower because for some people, they have a really clear idea of what their lifestyle is going to look like for a certain number of years, but other people don't know. And then depending on where you live and what your housing situation is, it might be harder to plan for those years where you might find yourself in long-term care. For many people who are homeowners, the obvious answer might be to sell your home and use the funds there to cover your long-term care costs, and it ends up being a bit of a horizontal move. But for people that are a little bit optimistic of I'm going to spend aggressively for 10 years and then my income or my spending needs, are going to drop over the next 10 and then they're going to drop again. In reality, I don't see that happening too often with the clients that I work with. Oftentimes when people actually have an abundance of savings above and beyond what they actually need, they end up giving more of it away. And that's where financial planning on an ongoing basis can really be helpful because there are more effective ways to do that. But this one here is worth giving some consideration to just at a high level. But again, in the scorecard, I didn't weight this one particularly high in terms of importance and the score that you might get depending on how you answer it. Number 4, do you know what kind of guaranteed income streams you're going to have? This could be CPP, OAS, pensions, things like that. Why is this important? Yeah, this one's a little bit obvious because having guaranteed income throughout retirement makes things a whole lot easier, and it really sets the foundational level of how much income you can expect through your whole life and not necessarily relying on the performance of the stock market or any of the investments that you pick. This next one kind of goes hand in hand, but have you calculated the gap between what your guaranteed income is going to be and what your other sources of income are going to be able to provide to meet your lifestyle goals? This starts to get a little bit tricky here, I'm sure you can understand, but the gap is the part that's on you and you got to figure out how you're going to do it. If you work with a financial advisor who's done a retirement plan for you, you might be able to work with them on this, but otherwise you're left to calculate a little bit more specifically how much you'll be able to get out of your portfolio to fill that gap between your guaranteed income and what you actually need to fund your lifestyle plus inflation, plus all the other things that come along with a fun and fulfilling retirement. Number 6, this one's getting into the weeds a little bit more, but I think it's important to consider. Do you have a plan for managing your required withdrawals from RSPs and other accounts? So the other accounts are probably things like a LIRA. If you have a pension, so in many cases, it's a defined contribution pension. So if you contribute to a pension at work that's not a defined benefit pension, a defined contribution pension, when you eventually leave, converts into something called a LIRA, which is a locked-in retirement account. Depending on the province that you live in, there could be minimums and maximums when you eventually convert this into an income-producing account called a LIF or a PRIF. Don't worry about the acronyms here, but if these are new terms to you, it's worth exploring that if it's a relevant factor for you. But for most people who have RSPs, understanding how the minimum withdrawals work, how tax implications work, income splitting, all those different things, that is worth having a plan to make sure that you are not surprised by anything or caught off guard when you have to start taking money out of these accounts. The next one, have you considered all the different ways that you can minimize tax in the withdrawal stage of your retirement? So there's all sorts of different things that you can do here in terms of optimizing. I'm not going to give you all of them because many of them won't be relevant depending on your situation. But if you're just looking at your retirement in terms of a big lump of savings that you're going to withdraw a set percentage out of every single year, it really ignores the impact of taxes and the ways that you can minimize taxes, especially in your retirement years. That can make things a lot more efficient for you, and it might actually simplify your retirement a little bit more because you have less tax to pay and you have to take less out of your investments every year. Question number 8, do you have a strategy for managing one-time expenses in retirement? Now, you might be thinking of things like emergencies or like big crisis types of expenses, but there's also fun things like, oh yeah, there's this trip that our friends called us about and they said that they wanted us to join them on doing this experience of a lifetime, whatever the situation might be. And you say, yeah, absolutely. Now, how do we come up with the money to do it? So depending on the different options you have available to you, cash on hand, you might have TFSAs, you might have non-registered investments, you might have RSPs, you might have one of those pensions that I talked about before. All of them have different withdrawal rules and different tax implications from withdrawing from it. So having a plan that accounts for those one-off either emergency expenses or fun expenses throughout retirement to make sure that you're not overpaying in taxes, impacting your other benefits that are income tested, things like that. It's really, really important to have a plan for those things. Number 9, do you know how much risk is appropriate for your investments at this stage of your life? This answer is going to be different for every single person, and it depends on how much you have invested right now, your experience with investing before, the general approach that you like to take, or perhaps your advisor likes to take, things like that. Oftentimes we see retirees want to scale back on their risk depending on their wiggle room that they have or what they're primarily investing for. For people who really need the entirety of their portfolio just to meet their spending needs, scaling back the risk, meaning your ability to take on risk, is quite a bit lower because this is everything that you've got and you really need to make it work. Where there are others who have oversaved and have significantly more, and they're kind of planning for the next generation. They're planning on what they should do with it after they've gone, meaning how to pass it on to their kids or to pass it along to charities. And so their investing approach is primarily less concerned about their own needs and the volatility that would come from that, but also they're thinking about the future and how they can maximize their gifts once they're gone. I'm not saying one is better than the other, or there's 101 different iterations of where that could fall in between there, but having an understanding of your situation, what kind of wiggle room you have to be able to take on risk, or your even necessity to take on risk to make sure that you have the growth potential to meet your income needs from your investments. Having a plan for how much risk you need or want to take on really, really matters because it impacts your asset allocation and your potential upside from your portfolio as well. Number 10, have you stress tested your portfolio? So this could look like a variety of different ways. There could be just a variance. So, what if you don't get a guaranteed 6% or 4% or 12% or whatever crazy number you want to use every single year forever? So if you haven't accounted for the actual volatility of the real world when it comes to your investment portfolio. That is something that you really need to consider. Another type of stress testing could look at specific what-if scenarios depending on where you're at. So things like a market crash at a wrong time, or the unexpected death of a spouse, or even the other way. So not always like bad things, but what happens if you get an inheritance, all these different things. Having a plan for those one-off scenarios in both directions, but mostly on the downside, those are worth considering as well. So stress testing your portfolio, I think, is really important. Number 11, do you have a plan for healthcare costs or long-term care costs? I kind of touched on this one already, but as you're planning for the future, this kind of falls under the what ifs. What if things don't work out perfectly? And what if you can't necessarily age in place at home? These are some more of the what if scenarios that are worth considering in advance, because trying to figure out where the money is going to come from when these scenarios pop up isn't a whole lot of fun. So being prepared for them long before they're ever an actual consideration is really important. Number 12, do you have a will and powers of attorney set up to help you with financial and healthcare decisions? So a will is something that kicks in once you've passed away. So it has nothing to do with any decision making while you're alive, but a will comes into force once you've passed away, and it determines who's in charge of making the decisions from there and where everything should go. Without a will, you're left to a specific set of rules depending on the province that you live in. No, the government doesn't take all your money, but they sure make it a lot more difficult for it to go to where you might want it to go. So having a will in place makes sure that if you were to pass away, everything goes the way that you want it to go. What does this have to do with being retirement ready? Well, from my perspective, the people who have the most confidence in their retirement plans are those who have thought of a lot of things, and the inevitability of each of our deaths is not one that anyone really loves to plan for, but those who have a plan for it, it's just another thing that they don't really have to worry about. They know that if something were to happen to them, everything is taken care of the way that they would want it. Power of attorney is something that would step in advance of that. So say you're unable or unwilling for whatever reason to make decisions on your own. Your power of attorney, so this can be a spouse, it could be a family member of another type, they can step in and then make decisions. They can open accounts for you. They can sell investments, whatever the case may be, on your behalf to be able to make sure that you can still maintain a comfortable lifestyle and to make sure that everything that needs to happen while you're still alive continues to keep happening. So making sure that these documents are in place is really, really important. This is not necessarily for retirement. This is just in general. If you have assets, if you have a spouse, if you have a family in particular, definitely make sure that you have a will and a power of attorney set up. Number 13, have you considered how to leave money to family, charities, or other causes in the most tax efficient way? So if you're someone who has investments that are probably going to outlive you, having a plan for how you pass those on to the next generation is really important. We would call this an estate plan. If you're charitably minded, there's all sorts of cool ways that you can incorporate charitable giving into your estate plan as well. Of course, there's tons of great ways to do that while you're alive as well, but making sure that you have a plan for how all of your assets are going to be transferred to the next generation or beyond to a charity of your choice, or any combination of those when you pass, I think is really important. Here's an example of how that could maybe go wrong when passing assets on to your family. So with RSPs and eventually RIFs, you can name your spouse as a beneficiary or a successor annuitant. In the case of a RIF, that means that your spouse would take over your account. They essentially absorb it into their own accounts and they would continue on as normal. There's no tax implications or anything like that. However, if there's no spouse to be named there, say you've got 2 kids and you name your 2 kids as the beneficiaries of your RSP, what happens there is that the kids would receive half of the proceeds each, but your estate is left with the tax bill because every dollar that was included in your RSP when you passed, again, this is just if you don't have a spouse to pass along to, every dollar that was in your account is treated as taxable income in the year that you pass. So even though, say there's $500,000 in there, each of your 2 kids would get $250,000, so $250,000 each, but your estate would be left with a massive tax bill potentially based on having $500,000 of income in the year that you passed. In most provinces, that means nearly half of that would go back for taxes. And how do they actually account for that? Eventually, CRA is going to come knocking on your kids' doors. And that process could take a long time. But if the kids already have the money and perhaps they've spent it, now you're in big trouble. So anyways, this is a hypothetical scenario, but we often see situations like this where people want to name their kids as beneficiaries of their RSPs. And we say, okay, let's be careful about this. Perhaps we need to have a specific plan for how we're going to account for this or account for the taxes that are going to be coming on this account. Number 14 is a bit more of a mindset type of question, but it's back to your portfolio a little bit. And the question is, if the market dropped by 30% tomorrow, would you feel confident in your plan? So this could come down to a few different practical things like your asset allocation, meaning do you understand how perhaps bonds and cash can act as a buffer in your account? Whatever other hedges you might have in there. You might also have more savings than you need to the tune of 30% plus. And so it might not impact everything that day. You also aren't going to liquidate your portfolio on the day you retire. You probably only need to liquidate a small portion of it every month as you go on. And so there's all sorts of different things that are at play here. But just as a general feeling, would you feel confident in your financial plan if the stock market were to drop 30% over the next few weeks? And the last one here is just a simple question. Do you feel confident that you're not going to run out of money in retirement? Running out of money is a real risk for a lot of people. So last week on the podcast, I recorded an episode about a bunch of different ways that you can both reduce your volatility and increase the longevity of your money by making a few small changes. If you're unsure of whether your money is going to last through retirement, checking out that episode would be a great next step. Thanks for listening or watching to this week's episode of the Canadian Money Roadmap. Again, if you want to check out the Retirement Readiness Scorecard, you can find the link below and you can see how you score based on the questions that we talked about here on this week's episode. Thanks again, and we'll see you on another episode.